I'm witnessing what might be the most absurd geopolitical catastrophe of our time. Tehran, a city of 15 million people, is running out of water. Not metaphorically, not eventually, right now. The Iranian president has openly discussed evacuating the capital, though apparently no one bothered asking where exactly 15 million climate refugees should relocate in a country that systematically poisoned its own water supply. This isn't a drought story. This is the story of how a regime spent 4 decades methodically dismantling one of history's most sophisticated water management systems, replacing 3,000-year-old engineering marvels with what can only be described as geological vandalism. When I started researching Iran's water crisis, I expected to find typical authoritarian incompetence. Instead, I discovered something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated destruction of an entire civilization's relationship with water, executed by a military-industrial complex that profits from the catastrophe it creates. The numbers are staggering and absurd in equal measure. Since 1979, Iran has constructed nearly 600 dams, making it the third largest dam builder on Earth after China and Japan. 600 dams, in a country where ancient engineers once moved water across impossible terrain using nothing but gravity and geometric precision. It's like watching someone replace a Swiss watch with a sledgehammer and then acting surprised when time stops working. But here's where this story transcends typical government failures and enters the realm of systematic civilization destruction. For millennia, Iran's survival depended on qanats, underground aqueducts that transported water from mountain aquifers to arid lowlands without losing a single drop to evaporation. These weren't primitive irrigation ditches. They were engineering masterpieces that sustained entire cities across some of the world's harshest terrain. Tehran itself was built around qanat systems that had functioned continuously for over 1,000 years. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps decided these ancient systems were insufficiently modern for their vision of industrial development. Through their construction conglomerate Qatam-al-Anbiya, the IRGC embarked on what can only be called hydrogeological warfare against their own country. They didn't just ignore the qanats, they actively destroyed them, drilling deep wells that deliberately drained the aquifers that fed these ancient systems. Entire farming communities that had survived for centuries simply vanished as their water sources collapsed. This destruction wasn't random incompetence, it was profitable incompetence. Every failed megaproject generated billions in contracts for IRGC-connected firms. The Gotvan Dam stands as perhaps the most spectacular example of profitable environmental terrorism ever conceived. Built directly on top of a massive salt dome despite explicit warnings from geologists, this $3.3 billion monument to corruption has spent the last decade systematically poisoning Iran's most important river system. The dam's reservoir functions as what engineers diplomatically call a brine factory. Every day it dissolves more of the underlying salt dome, increasing the Karun River's salinity by 35% and creating water so toxic it kills everything downstream. 400,000 date palms have died. Agricultural land spanning thousands of acres has been rendered permanently unusable. Millions of people now lack access to drinkable water from what was once Iran's most reliable freshwater source. When scientists raised concerns about building on a salt dome, IRGC officials dismissed them with what they called revolutionary engineering, apparently meaning engineering that revolutionizes how quickly you can destroy a river system. The project's budget ballooned from $1.5 billion to $3.3 billion, with zero public accountability, because nothing says revolutionary quite like doubling your construction costs while poisoning a major river. This is where Iran's water crisis reveals its true nature as a protection racket dressed up as development policy. The same IRGC network that profits from creating these disasters then positions itself as the sole provider of solutions, typically involving even more expensive and destructive megaprojects. It's like an arsonist selling fire insurance, except the arsonist controls the military and the insurance company is the national treasury. The IRGC's water monopoly operates through a deliberately created crisis cycle. Step 1, destroy traditional water systems that actually worked. Step 2, build environmentally catastrophic megaprojects that worsen the crisis. Step 3, demand emergency funding for even larger projects to solve the crisis you created. Step 4, repeat until you've extracted every possible dollar from the national water budget while rendering the country uninhabitable. Some Iranians refer to this network as the water mafia, a term that barely captures the systematic nature of their operations. Through Qatam-al-Anbiya, the IRGC controls every aspect of Iran's water infrastructure, designing projects that guarantee future problems and ensuring perpetual revenue streams from emergency repairs to systems they deliberately built to fail. Iranian MP Alireza Nesari publicly stated that Iran's crisis is primarily a governance failure, not meteorological. The IRGC has weaponized hydrology for profit, turning water engineering into a systematic extraction mechanism that they've exported to Syria, Iraq, and Venezuela. Iranian officials now use a term that perfectly captures the mathematical impossibility of their situation: water bankruptcy. This means structural water demand permanently exceeds renewable supply, a hydrological death spiral with no conventional exit strategy. Iran is consuming water faster than nature can replace it, while simultaneously poisoning the water that remains available. The regime's response to reaching water bankruptcy has been to drill deeper and build bigger, like a gambling addict doubling down with money they don't have. They've drilled wells so deep they've caused land subsidence across entire provinces. Satellite images show Iranian cities literally sinking as the ground collapses into drained aquifers. In some areas, the land has dropped by more than 3 meters, creating permanent depressions that serve as monuments to hydrogeological insanity. Meanwhile, state-run media has begun using a new phrase that reveals how thoroughly the crisis has destabilized Iranian society: water refugees. Entire communities are abandoning provinces like Isfahan, Yazd and Kerman as wells run dry and dust storms make agriculture impossible. These internal migrants are flooding northern provinces like Gilan and Mazandaran, where rainfall is still sufficient to sustain human life. The political implications of mass internal migration are staggering. These water refugees aren't just changing location, they're undermining the regime's entire geographical power structure. Rural loyalty has traditionally provided the clerical dictatorship with territorial depth and political stability. When villages empty and younger families flee north, the regime loses not just population but legitimacy. It becomes impossible to claim that decades of revolutionary development brought prosperity when people are literally fleeing for water. But the regime's commitment to profitable destruction extends beyond rivers and aquifers. They've deliberately cited the most water-intensive industries in the country's driest regions. Nuclear enrichment facilities in Natanz and Isfahan, massive steel plants, petrochemical complexes, all located hundreds of kilometers from any natural water source, forcing them to drain rivers and aquifers at accelerated rates. This placement wasn't accidental, it was strategic. By putting heavy industry in the interior, the IRGC created a captive market for their water transfer schemes. Every steel plant in Yazd province requires water to be pumped hundreds of kilometers from increasingly scarce sources. Every litre becomes justification for another billion-dollar transfer project, another opportunity for construction contracts, another round of profitable environmental destruction. The cryptocurrency mining operations represent the regime's commitment to profitable destruction taken to almost comedic extremes. In a country facing electricity shortages so severe that hospitals lose power during summer heat waves, the IRGC has authorized massive Bitcoin mining farms that consume more electricity than entire provinces. One facility in Tehran reportedly uses as much power as 11 provinces combined. While ordinary Iranians endure rolling blackouts, Chinese and IRGC-linked operators run 24/7 mining operations with subsidized electricity rates. By 2021, Iran accounted for roughly 4.5% of global Bitcoin mining, diverting between 600 and 2,000 megawatts from the national grid, up to 20% of the country's peak power deficit. This happened while the regime imposed rolling blackouts on residential areas during deadly heat waves. The mathematical insanity is breathtaking. They're using enough electricity to power major cities to mine digital currency that primarily benefits Chinese partners and IRGC officials, while Iranian children die in hospitals without air conditioning. The mining operations also require massive cooling systems that consume enormous quantities of water in a country approaching water bankruptcy. Each mining facility uses industrial-scale cooling that draws from the same aquifers that urban populations depend on for drinking water. The regime essentially decided that generating cryptocurrency profits was more important than providing basic electricity and water to its own citizens. This reveals the true nature of the IRGC's economic strategy. They're strip mining Iran's natural and human resources for maximum short-term extraction before the system collapses entirely. They know the current trajectory is unsustainable, but they're determined to extract every possible dollar before the mathematical impossibility of water bankruptcy makes the country uninhabitable. As water bankruptcy accelerates towards systemic collapse, 3 scenarios emerge from this manufactured catastrophe. The first scenario involves successful regime change followed by internationally coordinated water recovery. This would require dismantling the IRGC's construction monopoly and implementing emergency measures designed by genuine hydrologists rather than revolutionary engineers. International partnerships, Israeli technology, Australian data management, Singaporean urban planning, Dutch water management, Saudi financing could theoretically reverse decades of damage within a generation. The second scenario is controlled collapse with mass emigration. Iran's population slowly abandons the interior provinces as they become uninhabitable, concentrating in coastal areas while the central plateau reverts to desert. This scenario minimizes immediate suffering, but essentially concedes that vast portions of Iranian territory are permanently lost to human habitation. The third scenario is the one that keeps regional security analysts awake at night: systemic state failure driven by water collapse. Mass migration overwhelms neighbouring countries already struggling with their own water challenges. Turkey, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan all face similar droughts and would be catastrophically destabilised by millions of Iranian water refugees. Regional conflicts over remaining water sources become inevitable as demographic pressure creates resource competition that existing institutions cannot manage. What makes Iran's crisis particularly dangerous is its timing. The broader Middle East, Central Asia and South Asia are all experiencing unprecedented water stress simultaneously. The traditional escape valve of migration becomes impossible when destination countries are facing their own water emergencies. A regional water crisis of this magnitude hasn't occurred since the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations, except this time it's happening in a region with nuclear weapons, advanced military technology and minimal international cooperation frameworks. Afghanistan's Kosh-Tepe Canal is reducing flow to the AMU Darya River. Russia's increased use of the Volga River contributes to Caspian Sea decline. China's greater draw from the ILI and Irtysh rivers reduces flow to Kazakhstan's Lake Balkhash. The entire regional water system is under simultaneous stress, creating a crisis that transcends any single country's failures. Central Asia depends on glacial melt from the Tian Shan and Pamir Mountains, but those glaciers are retreating at unprecedented speed. The region Marco Polo described for its excellent pastures risks becoming uninhabitable desert within decades. Turkey, which receives millions of Iranian tourists and seasonal workers, would face an impossible humanitarian burden if large-scale emigration begins. Iraq's own water crisis, exacerbated by upstream damming in Turkey and Iran, means it cannot absorb Iranian refugees. Pakistan already hosts millions of Afghan refugees and lacks the infrastructure to handle additional massive influxes. The mathematical reality is that there's nowhere for Iranian water refugees to go, which makes the crisis exponentially more dangerous. The Iranian regime's greatest strategic miscalculation may be its assumption that water scarcity creates dependency and therefore political control. The opposite appears to be happening. As basic survival becomes impossible in large parts of the country, people aren't becoming more compliant, they're becoming more desperate and therefore more willing to risk everything for change. International observers who focus on Iran's nuclear program or regional military activities are missing the real story. The Islamic Republic isn't being contained by sanctions or regional isolation, it's being destroyed by its own systematic assault on the physical foundations of Iranian civilization. When a regime makes its own territory uninhabitable, traditional geopolitical concepts like deterrence and containment become irrelevant. You can't deter a government that's already committing ecological suicide. The bitter irony is that Iran pioneered sustainable water management long before the term existed. For 3 millennia, Iranian engineers demonstrated that human civilization could thrive in arid environments through cooperation with natural systems rather than domination over them. The qanat technology they developed was so sophisticated that similar systems spread across the Islamic world and survive today in places as distant as Spain and Morocco. Destroying that legacy required deliberate, sustained effort over decades. It couldn't happen by accident or through mere incompetence. The IRGC's water policies represent the systematic conversion of a 3,000-year-old civilization into a 21st-century extraction operation with national water resources serving as raw materials for financial and political profit. The international community's response to Iran's water bankruptcy will determine whether this crisis remains a regional catastrophe or becomes a civilizational collapse with global implications. Water refugees don't respect borders, and water wars don't limit themselves to original combatants. Iran's crisis is a preview of climate-accelerated state failure, and we're all living in the same climate. Current international sanctions, while targeting Iran's nuclear program and regional military activities, may be inadvertently accelerating the water crisis by blocking access to advanced water treatment technologies. This creates a perverse situation where efforts to contain Iran's military capabilities may be hastening demographic collapse that could destabilize the entire region. European policymakers who already struggle with migration pressures should understand that Iran's water bankruptcy could trigger refugee flows that make the Syrian crisis look manageable by comparison. China and Russia, despite their strategic partnerships with Iran, are unprepared for the economic and security implications of Iranian state failure. The most tragic aspect may be that this crisis was entirely preventable. With proper management, Iran's water resources could have supported a much larger population than currently exists. The IRGC's systematic destruction of qanat systems represents perhaps the greatest act of civilizational vandalism in modern history. As I write this, Tehran's residents are experiencing water rationing during a heat wave that has pushed temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks. The regime that promised to export revolution has instead exported water to neighboring countries while its own capital approaches day zero. In the end, the Islamic Republic's most lasting legacy may be proving that even the world's most sophisticated ancient engineering can be destroyed by sufficiently determined modern stupidity. The clerical dictatorship built its power by claiming divine authority over Iranian society, but there's nothing divine about deliberately poisoning your own water supply. There's nothing revolutionary about destroying systems that work for 3,000 years. And there's nothing strategic about making your own territory uninhabitable. Iran's water crisis isn't a natural disaster. It's a man-made one, created by men who valued profit over survival and ideology over reality. When the last qanat runs dry, they'll have achieved something unprecedented in human history, the complete destruction of one of the world's most water-efficient civilizations by the people who claim to be its guardians.